Well, it's 6:01, so I'm going to go ahead and get our mini workshop on evergreen trees going here. So first of all, just thank you for taking the time to share an hour of your evening with me, wherever you are. It looks like we're all so far in the United States, and it's just always such a joy to get to share some of my favorite watercolor and painting techniques with such a big audience of both, current students and past students, as well as new folks who this might be your first class with me. So welcome. I'm so excited you're here. And just to kind of give you a flow of how our time together will go, I'll start by just kind of diving into our content together. And then toward the end, probably the last like 15 minutes or so will kind of be my goal. Maybe even a little bit more than that. We'll have some time for open Q&A where I can continue. I'll keep my camera facing down so I can demo things directly on a piece of paper and kind of show folks specific techniques that way, and just kind of answer questions about evergreen trees or other things you're curious about with watercolor if they're within the scope that I can work on today. So excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and pause my camera and get it turned around. As far as materials I'm using today, I have a pencil, some various waterproof pens, which I'll talk more about as we get going. A paintbrush. I'm really partial to having a number 10 kind of round paintbrush. These have a really fine tip once I get them wet. So I can do a lot of my paintings from small ones to pretty big ones with just a single brush. So I'm a really big fan of being able to use one brush for as much of my painting as possible. As far as paints, I encourage you just to use whatever you have on hand. This is my palette filled with Daniel Smith paints. This one's made by Art Toolkit. It's a little kind of portable palette. It's aluminum, very, very light. The pans, I fill them from tubes of paint, and the pans actually come out so I can trade and rearrange and also refill and clean. And this palette is just coming off of a 2.5, almost 3-week trip up in Alaska and the Yukon. So it is this is its natural state. My palette is clean pretty much only after I clean it, and it reverts back to this. So it doesn't stress me out. It definitely stressed out some of my students in Alaska. They were very sad to get their palettes dirty. But there is, I've come to appreciate the well-loved palette. So for trees, and evergreen trees are such a magical component of Northwest landscapes, and I'm so excited to share with you kind of some of my favorite ways of just thinking about trees and exploring them, because there's so many different ways to tell the stories of trees. In some scenes in the Northwest, we will have trees that are really far away, so they appear as just little teeny tiny lines on a distant ridgeline. And this is a scene from Crater Lake that I made out there. But other times we'll have trees that are kind of closer in, like this one. They'll be bigger, and we can see more of the branches and more of the kind of individual shapes and personalities of the trees. And then even kind of a step further, trees might be a very dominant part of our overall landscape, like they are in this one. And all three of these paintings and kind of most of the examples I'll be showing you are actually they're paintings that I made for some of my Adventure Art Academy classes, which I'll talk a little bit more about later if folks are interested. But basically, I love to share paintings, and those are classes that I film outside and on site, and then get to share with those students. So I wanted to just first thing share with you a resource that I found about 12 years ago, or maybe even a little bit more now. This is an amazing book. It's Northwest Trees. So it's literally all about Northwest trees. It's illustrated by Ramona P. Hammerly. And this thing is incredible. She has some of the most beautiful, let me slide this over a little bit. There's some of the most beautiful tree illustrations that I have found in any book. And they're a lot more detailed than what I normally do in my typical watercolor painting. But studying this book and just looking at how she was expressing line and shape and pattern really, really helped me kind of early on when I was trying to figure out, how do trees have different personalities, and how can I convey that? And so by looking at kind of her really detailed forms, that really just helped me a ton. So I cannot recommend this book enough. Again, it's Northwest Trees, and I'll include a link to this book when I send a follow-up email with the recording for everyone. So don't worry about writing it down unless you would like to. So she has also some illustrations of mountains as well as silhouetted trees. And these were some of the most helpful, were these silhouetted ones, because very often in my paintings, I lean toward doing silhouettes because they're a little bit simpler and easier to paint and to sketch. And let's see if I can find some more. And she also has deciduous trees in this book as well. So this is a yew, so that's still an evergreen. But again, love this book. It's been an incredible resource throughout my kind of artistic pen painting career and journey. So to start things out, I thought that we just kind of start with getting warmed up a little bit with watercolor and then diving right into how I approach painting trees that are kind of that far away appearance. So the little tiny trees along a ridge line, or like in that painting for Crater Lake. So I'm zoom in a little bit here. So to start things out, just go ahead and get your paintbrush, get some water on that paintbrush, and I'll try to get my cup of water also back in view here so folks can kind of see when I go back and forth between the cup and the page. I've been told that's helpful. And I'm just going to make kind of a nice puddle of paint here. You can use whatever nice dark color you want. I have one called Indian Throne Blue that I love, so I'm going to use some of that. I'm going to use this as a chance to kind of clean off the top of my palette as well. There's some lovely dark colors up there already. And once I have some paint on that paintbrush, I'm just going to kind of load up the paintbrush and then go over to a corner of my page and just start making some marks on that page. Some angled, some vertical, some horizontal. And as I'm making those marks on the page, I'm going to just kind of see what happens if I add kind of more water and pigment to my paintbrush. So what happens when I kind of really have this thing loaded? How does that impact kind of the lines and the shapes that I can make across my page? And then what happens if maybe I kind of squeegee off the edge of that paintbrush along the edge of my palette, or even kind of maybe kind of wipe off a little bit of the extra moisture on a paper towel, and seeing then what kind of lines and marks I make with a paintbrush that still is loaded just fine with paint, but maybe isn't totally laden down with a whole bunch of pigment and a whole bunch of water. Because I find that oftentimes one of the hardest things about watercolor is just kind of getting an understanding of, how does the amount of pigment and water literally on our paintbrush impact all the different things that are going to happen in our beautiful painting. And again, don't be afraid to drop questions in the chat. In my mind, there's no such thing as a dumb question, especially with watercolor, which is such a beautiful but tempestuous and unpredictable medium as well. So once you've made some marks on the page, then I want to just invite you to see what happens if you make some just kind of vertical marks on your page. And as you're making those vertical marks, see what happens if you start that brush stroke with less pressure and increase the pressure of the paintbrush as you move the paintbrush down. And then also see what happens if you start with heavier pressure and then decrease the pressure as you lift your paintbrush down the page. And just see how those two changes, so the amount of pressure and when you apply it to your brush stroke, impacts the shape that you're able to make on that page. At this stage, it's also useful just to kind of see what happens to our little vertical marks here if we kind of change the way that we're orienting our hand on our paper. So oftentimes the kind of native tendency is to want to hold a paintbrush exactly like we would if we're writing with a pencil or we're working with a pen. And that's really good for a lot of detailed work. Like this is how I will hold my paintbrush if I'm making beautiful kind of rocky patterns. But sometimes for trees, especially if I want more vertical lines, I find that turning my hand, kind of the whole hand facing upward, so it's perpendicular to the bottom of my page, which makes it more comfortable for me to be able to kind of make those a little bit more vertical brush strokes across the page. This also, at least for my hand structure, helps me to be able to kind of get a brush stroke that has a little bit more of that teardrop shape. Because when I'm going sideways like this, it's a lot harder to get that kind of, very nice thin top to that brush stroke. And the reason that I'm having us practice this little brush stroke practice so much is because this is kind of the foundation for trees that are far away. And I'll show this a little bit faster to start, and then I'll break down the concepts afterward. So if we have an imaginary ridge line right here, and I want to cover this with trees, which is a very common thing that occurs so often in the Pacific Northwest, I'm just going to use this same brushstroke pattern, where I have that kind of semi-teardrop shape. I'm just going to overlap those brushstrokes a little bit, and I'm going to vary kind of the height that they go up the page. And the effect of those when they're kind of strung all together across a lovely little shape like this is that we will get this really organic, nice appearance of trees that are kind of in the distance. Because I'm here just inviting my paintbrush to do all of that hard work for me. And if I miss a spot, I can just come back and put a tree there. If I have an area where I have trees that all were kind of the same shape and I don't like that, I can just erase them by going over them and extending the shape or changing the shape. Then once I kind of go all the way across that little fake ridge line, I'll just grab my paintbrush and then just kind of slide that paint and carry it down the page. If I want to add a slight atmospheric effect, then I'll just rinse that paintbrush, then introduce a little bit of clean water to that little area as I continue to draw it down the page. So I will show that again, because I know that it's kind of confusing, especially if this is the first time that we've done it. So let me get my page position here again for us. So to show that once again, I just started out by having a nice line across the page, and I'm going to switch up my colors a little bit. This time around, I'm going to use, still going to have some of that lovely dark Indian Throne blue color, but this time around, I'm going to add a little bit of a granulating green. This is a really fun, interesting green color I've used a fair bit. It's called Perylene green, and it's a little bit, this one is definitely takes a bit more agitation to get it up out of the palette, but you can see how that's changing my color and kind of leaning it more toward the greenish side and adding a paint that granulates. So this one over here is, and granulation just means that it has a slight sandy texture to it when it's in action on the page. And we'll get to see that kind of contrast from the upper area to the lower one. So again, I'm going to kind of start with, my little ridge line here. And if we're newer to painting trees and we find that this kind of line dries on us and stays with it within our painting, you can always just do a pencil sketch line here. But I do encourage you, just don't be afraid to kind of, just go for it and see what happens. So again, I'm just kind of overlapping those kind of vertical brush strokes as I go across this shape. I'm going to try to shape, change the height that I go. That will increase the kind of natural appearance of all of those trees. But I'm also just not being afraid just to kind of go for it. These trees, if we overthink them a lot, they often get a little bit harder. And just also know that sometimes the shape of our paintbrush will make this a lot harder. Like if we have a paintbrush that's really kind of flat and blunt at the tip, then most of your trees might have kind of this more kind of rounded appearance to them, like this kind of shape. And it's a little bit more rounded on the top and then less kind of tapered. And if that's the case, then that's just a materials limitation and not a you limitation. It's one of my favorite things to help students realize in my kind of main Adventure Art Academy classes is that through email and stuff, we can kind of look at their tools and their paintings and we can figure out, when something is a technique we want to practice. And then sometimes it's just a material limitation. It's always so exciting to find those because it's such an easy fix, like a new paintbrush. This paintbrush I'm using is a really affordable one. I think I got it on sale for like $5 or $7. So I also use cheap paintbrushes because I go through them really fast. So unlike some artists, I don't spritz my palette with water, or I don't put little drops of water on the dry pans to kind of reactivate them or re-wet them. I just use my paintbrush to kind of get the paint out. You might have seen me literally rolling the paintbrush in the Perylene green patch. As a result of that, my paintbrush gets kind of dull over time, especially when my palette like it does right now, and when my paintings got a lot of sand and glacier grit in them while painting in Alaska, that just kind of exacerbates the wear on a paintbrush. So does that make sense to folks, kind of how we can use just the natural shape of our paintbrush? I would love to hear in the chat, like, did that make sense? How did it go? Do we want to see a demo of this one more time for folks? I saw a bunch of nodding faces, so thank you for giving me that lovely feedback. I appreciate that. Yeah, we're a pretty big group sitting at about 50, so definitely having everybody on mute is going to be the easiest. Oh, I got a wonderful note from Danny that turning the hand really helps. I'm so glad. Yeah, like if I zoom out, I change my hand position a ton. For this kind of painting that we're doing here, my hand really is pretty darn, it's pretty perpendicular to the bottom. And I'm kind of just using like this little kind of like in and out motion. And you can actually use that kind of sewing machine in and out motion if you have a really big area to cover. This is a little shortcut that I will often do. And my students who've been with me for a long time, they already know that I am a huge fan of shortcuts. So what I can sometimes do is this is my ridge line again, with a paintbrush that's this pointed. And also something I'll show you too, if you have a paintbrush that just refuses to go to a fine point, you can actually kind of on your palette or mixing area, you can kind of splay the bristles like this, go on one side, flip it 180 degrees and kind of do it on the other side and flip it again. And what that does is that as long as my paintbrush isn't too overloaded, you can see how now I have a flat broad side and then a narrow, pretty tapered side. So I can get much more kind of fine marks that way. Yeah, and someone mentioned they have to work, backwards, going bottom to top to get the teardrop shape. That's totally normal sometimes, especially if we have there's kind of a paintbrush that's less conducive to this. It's a little bit less efficient over time, so you're kind of having to work with your hand at a weird angle, but you can definitely do trees that way too. I find it quite a bit harder to get kind of consistent vertical strokes if I am going from the up above, but again, sometimes our materials will just kind of demand that of us. So my little shortcut method, I'll move it down here so you can see it better, is that with this paintbrush that I know pretty well, I can almost kind of sewing machine my hand, my kind of brush strokes. So what I mean by that, instead of lifting my paintbrush with every tree, I'm just going to kind of like go up and down. So I'm making a continuous mark across the page. And the only big downside of this is that I do get a lot more kind of regularity in my trees. I have a lot less kind of natural organic patterning happening. But if I'm working on a giant painting, like, you know, a half sheet in the field, then I will absolutely do some of this or combine that with like some other brush strokes thrown in. So I can kind of use those two different techniques to my advantage just to kind of save myself some time. If it's a smaller painting that is reasonably sized and I don't have a time constraint, then I won't worry about it too much. But I've definitely, you know, never shy away from just doing whatever the most efficient method is. And for this one, really having that hand being kind of pointing up toward the page is that, at least for the way that my hand feels, it feels kind of necessary. And if I were to kind of expand out what that brushstroke looks like, I'm basically doing this. And if, you know, if I take this kind of zigzag pattern and just condense those zigzags together and kind of change the amount of pressure I'm applying to them, that's what gives rise to kind of that faster approach to trees. And again, I'll often come back and kind of put in some less regular brush strokes in there as well. And, you know, I share both of those because sometimes folks find one easier than the other. I, you know, started out doing a little bit more slow and deliberate way, and then over time, you know, end up integrating both into the painting depending on how I'm feeling about it and how just kind of the level of detail that I want. And the last thing I want to show you guys for trees that are far away is what I kind of showed in that Crater Lake painting a little while ago. So, you know, what happens if the trees aren't all on a ridge line, but we have a bunch of trees that are far away and they're all kind of spaced out. So maybe let's say I have this kind of shoulder, maybe this is a peak somewhere in Colorado or just kind of right along tree line somewhere. And if that's the case, then I'll just make sure to start that I don't have too much paint on my paintbrush. Because I want to be able to make really small little kind of tapping, dashing brush strokes. And I want them to leave behind paint, but not like a bead of paint. A bead of paint refers to kind of a raised, like we've added that kind of makes a little puddle on our page basically. So if I'm getting like a big bead of paint or my paintbrush isn't doing a fine tip for me, then what I'll do is I'll just kind of roll the base of the bristles right along a paper towel. And what that does is that soaks up the extra moisture, but it often leaves most of our paint behind. So now I have a bit more control with my brush stroke. So then I can come in here and instead of overlapping my brush strokes everywhere, I'm just going to kind of put a couple little kind of tapping, dashing, you know, little strokes kind of changing the shape. Some will overlap, some won't. And this will feel kind of slow the first few times we do it, but then it can get pretty fast over time. So I'll just kind of, you know, you can imagine I'm building up kind of, here's this tree line here, and I'll have some areas where the trees kind of go more densely up the ridge lines, then other areas where the trees are maybe a little bit more sparse. And you can just do this, you know, it takes time. It almost feels like I'm shaking my hand because I'm like I'm tensing my fingers around the paintbrush and kind of trying to almost vibrate my paintbrush so I can try to go like as fast as I can. Because I'm just putting little tiny dashes in there. And then this is where the magic happens. I'm going to rinse that paintbrush off. I'm going to wipe off the extra moisture on the edge of my cup. And I'm also going to kind of wipe off most of the extra moisture on my paper towel. Because then I'm going to come in here and just kind of gently kind of run this paintbrush along and then wipe off extra paint periodically. Just kind of run this paintbrush near and around and just kind of in proximity to basically some of these little trees. And what that does is I'm just kind of diluting and sliding around some paint, and that will help these little tiny trees feel kind of embedded into the ground that they are sitting on. So hopefully it's coming across on the computer screen, just kind of how quickly this can kind of transform trees that feel very pasted on to trees that really do feel kind of actually stuck into that landscape. And it also, when we do this, gives us a lot of natural variation in terms of the value of the color we're using. So in this context, value refers to the range of light and dark. So I have some dark trees and I have some very light ones that came about from my clean water brush picking up that pigment and kind of moving it around on the page. Will that work for folks? I'd love to hear in the chat. And if you have any questions, let me know because I'm ready to move on to our next technique. And this one took me a long time to figure out, I'll be honest. because I definitely, like someone just mentioned, they struggle with pasted on trees. Yes, I struggle with that so much. And when I finally figured this out, it was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I just cut 5 miles off of every painting where we have a ton of trees like that. Okay, I'm gonna start moving this aside so this little paper can dry. And again, I can kind of show you that example now that you've seen this type of technique in action. I can show you that painting of Crater Lake again, and you can see that, that's how I approached making these trees appear, which is that little tiny brush strokes and then kind of fading and blending them in. And this is honestly one of my absolute favorite paintings I've ever made and classes I've ever filmed because it was just like everything aligned, right? I had terrible weather for most of my residency at Crater Lake last year. And over here in this corner, you can just see this kind of big blob right here. It's kind of like a big starburst pattern. That happened when, I had my trees done, my beautiful, crater rim done, was feeling so proud of the painting. I was getting ready to dive into the terrifying reflection. And sure enough, I'm starting it. And then I'm trying to make kind of a somewhat perfect reflection, right? And then all of a sudden I drop a huge bundle of water right here in the whole painting and everything just goes sideways. So I had to change my entire tactic for the water. And I really ended up loving the way it turned out. It was such a fortuitous and happy accident. And it forced me to kind of reconsider how I was painting reflections. And I think the whole thing came together in like 5 or 6 minutes, which was incredible. And I just felt so lucky that like my little camera was rolling. So I got to share it with my students, which was so fun. So it's one of my favorites. So next up, we're going to kind of work from, far away trees and progressively closer. And at the end, if we have time, I'll kind of address a few specialty tree techniques. So here's another example of that same kind of, sewing machine, little kind of distant trees. So this painting kind of shows all the trees in action, actually. We have the little ones here, ones that have a few more branches, and then ones that have a lot more detail over on this side of the painting. So next, together, we're going to do the kind of trees that have that nice balance of, they have a little bit of branches, but not too many branches, which is a type of tree that I do a lot. And we again see this also a ton in just generic Northwest landscapes, pretty much almost in most places in the state if there's evergreen trees at play. So I'm starting out by just giving myself a nice big kind of puddle of paint to play with. And let's see, what color should I do these trees in? Let's have a little more fun. So I'm going to show you a really interesting mixture that I kind of love to make kind of dark shadowy colors. So there's this green that you see in a lot of palettes. This color, this is the phthalo green, like blue shade, is typically the color that you see. And this color, it almost never appears in nature. And one of my favorite ways to use it is I'll take that, like add some other blue if I want, and then I'll just add rose to that green mixture. And I love it because it takes that crazy green, and especially if I add just a teeny bit of blue to it, turns it into this just like spectacular grayish, purplish, beautiful color. So I have a ton of fun with that color mixture. And again, that was the combination of that really kind of vibrant green that we saw right there, that phthalo green, and combining that with some rose, which you would not expect, but those two together actually do make this really spectacular variety of colors. So I love that one. So I'm going to play with that. And it also had a little bit of my other dark blue in it too. So I'm going to use that. So now let's say I want to do a tree that has a trunk in it and we can see some branches. So almost always my trees will start with a trunk of some kind. So I'll have my little trunk right here. And I don't worry about making them perfectly straight. One, because I just almost never do. One way or the other, I'll mess them up somehow. And I just let go of that, proclivity for perfection as readily as I can, just so I don't stress about it. And two, it also works to my advantage because very rarely are trees in nature, especially in alpine areas, are they actually straight. They're usually leaning to some degree. And then to make all the pretty little branches on this shape, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a combination of brush strokes. I'm going to use little kind of taps, dots, dashes, swoops, almost like little Nike swooshes at sometimes. I'm going to use these kind of brush strokes. And depending on how narrow or wide or bushy or sparse I want that tree to appear, I will, change the amount of water on my paintbrush. I'll make it, less watery and more controlled. Or if I want broader brush strokes, then I'll use more water on my paintbrush. So when I apply these brush strokes to a little tree over here, what that looks like is I just kind of say, okay, I'm going to start out with a somewhat symmetrical tree where it'll have branches on both sides. I'm just kind of tapping and dashing those colors across that tree. And I'm noticing right away that like my brush strokes, some of them are ending in kind of blunt little shapes. that's telling me that most likely I actually have too much paint on that paintbrush. So again, I'm going to kind of wipe off some of the extra moisture, pick up a little bit more paint, but not much. And now, yep, there we go. See how I'm able to get a little bit more kind of controlled brush strokes going across that whole tree? So that was just kind of as a result of changing up the amount of water on that paintbrush. One of my other kind of things that I like to think about a lot is not being afraid to leave little white spaces in that tree, even when they're small like this and kind of far away looking still. The little white spaces just kind of give that beautiful impression of water kind of showing through into our trees. So I'll show that again in case that's helpful for folks. So we started with our lovely tree trunk. And this time, let's make this tree, it's going to be a Krummholz, which is a German word for a tree that has been kind of gnarled by its environmental conditions, one of my favorite words. And when a Krummholz just basically will have a lot of asymmetry in its shape and that kind of thing. So this one, I'm going to have like a few branches up top. And it's going to have kind of a big bundle of branches that like kind of lean and wind their way off to the right-hand side. And then we'll have just a couple, like maybe little dead branches off on the left. And you can imagine this tree might be kind of sitting on a rock or something like that. So whenever I'm thinking of trees, as soon as I start adding branches, something that I think about a lot is, this is a phrase I think I shared in the little mountain workshop I did a few months ago as well. And that phrase is to kind of stop naming and start seeing. What I mean by that phrase is that oftentimes when we think of trees and then when we start painting them, our brains will kind of subconsciously go back to this really early image that we often have of this as an evergreen tree. It's this perfectly symmetrical thing. And, you just have this big grove of trees, and this is like the flashcards in kindergarten, right? And as lovely as that is to have this kind of overall arching image that we can all agree on as an evergreen tree, then when I come to actually start trying to paint individual trees, my brain wants to revert back to this. And it's hilarious because, and I've seen this a few times in classes I filmed too, if I get on a side tangent and start talking and stop paying attention, I will subconsciously make a symmetrical tree. So we have to kind of stop naming this as like tree or Douglas fir or whatever it is, and just try to see the shapes and patterns that it has. And if you went to Catholic school, there's also like a little star on top of that tree, inevitably, which is just so funny. So again, I'm trying to embrace the asymmetry of my trees. It's a bad pun, I know, but hopefully you won't forget it that way. So this, in the same kind of idea, whether we're doing, this kind of a little mid-sized tree, or if we have kind of a whole gathering of kind of taller trees, again, I'm thinking about asymmetrical shapes for them. So like these little guys here, even if there's just a few tiny little branches sticking off of these trees, I'm just going to try not to make them all the same. I'm going to have some that will stick out a little bit more, and some that won't stick out as far, and some that will have a sparse top to the tree, and some that will have a wide top to the tree. And also oftentimes, even when I have a bunch of little trees like this, I'll combine that with the other tree painting method we just did, the far away trees method, because it just makes it so much easier to fill in all this space and make it look like trees or foliage. So those two together is a really kind of powerful shorthand just to indicate a very typical Northwest component to a painting. So I do this a ton. It's something that shows up in almost, like so many landscapes. And it shows up in, like shorelines with trees, distant ridge lines with trees, coastal trees. Like it's just, we see this phenomena a lot. Any questions from folks about this before I kind of share this same idea about on a little bit bigger scale for maybe a tree that we see a little bit more detail with it? And again, don't be afraid. There's no such thing as a stupid question, especially for trees, because trees are insanely difficult. I, in my mind, kind of think about them, on par with trying to learn how to paint people. And like, I'm terrible at painting people, but I have lots of practice painting trees because every tree has a unique personality and shape. So part of my job I see as an artist is to, with each tree I paint, if I'm, really, if it's a focal point in a painting, is I'm just trying to kind of recognize and see what are the unique patterns and shapes that make the tree unique and make it stand out. And Erin asked if there's a certain weight of paper that's my go-to. So thanks for asking about paper. I forgot to mention that earlier. This paper I'm using right now is a very cheap, affordable 140-pound watercolor paper. It's just the big Canson XL watercolor paper pad. It's non-archival, so it's a non-cotton paper, which means that this will yellow and degrade over time. So I don't make any of my nicer sketches or paintings or really any of my field work on this. I only demo on it because it's really affordable again. So it's great for practice. And this will all be in the follow-up email to you guys. I'll link to a page that has all the info. But then most of the time I do my main paintings on a 140-pound cold press paper. And those cold press papers will also give you more flexibility just for the drying time of the page and kind of the ability to move pigment around it because it doesn't dry out as fast. So for an example, I can share with you, I'll try to keep the painting clean. That's always half the struggle. Like in this painting here, which was filmed up near Artist Point in Washington, because my paper just stayed wet a lot longer, I'm able to get these kind of really soft, beautiful atmospheric effects because those edges of where I put the paint, that gave me a lot of time to kind of blend them out. And I also this paper is more forgiving for kind of everything. So, and also this is a good way to show the kind of trees we just did. If you just vary the amount of paint that you use, you can get kind of this layered effect of trees. And I can show that to us if we have time as well. Yes, Ali asked if I change the color or as I make different strokes. So for this like scale of trees where it's kind of all farther away or smaller, I will try not to change things too much. But then for these bigger trees, like I was going to show you next anyway, so that's a great segue. For anything that has a bigger appearance, then I will start changing up the colors in that tree. My go-to and favorite way to do it is just to have it kind of just be changing kind of as I go down the tree and avoid doing multiple layers because I like shortcuts and I like efficiency when I'm painting. My painting nickname from my group in Alaska was efficiency mode because I just love to be able to do something as efficiently as possible and not get freezing cold in front of a glacier, which usually happens anyway. So in illustration of Ali's question, let's say I'm now doing a bigger tree and I'm just for fun, I'm going to have this tree go from kind of a more greenish color up top and it'll fade down into kind of some more purple colors near the bottom. So I'm going to start with a nice fair bit of green on my paintbrush. And this tree, I'm going to start by demoing kind of a more big vertical tree, and then we'll also do one that's kind of more angled. So this is the exact same concept as what we did over here. There's taps, dashes, swoops, but I'm just going to make a little bit bigger taps, dashes, and swoops. And because I'm going to go pretty quickly down the tree, I can be changing my pigment as I go down. So I can change the appearance of the colors as I work my way down. So again, I'm just kind of tapping, dashing, swooping, again, looking for kind of an asymmetrical appearance in this tree. This is easier if we have a reference image, right? Because if we have something specific to look at, then that makes it easier. And as I go down, like right there, I'm grabbing some dark blue now. So I'm introducing a new color into that painting, not shying away from leaving some pretty little white spaces in there. I'm also going to grab now, as I go toward the bottom, just throw in some pink on my paintbrush. And now I'm going to segue this tree into a lovely kind of dark purple near the bottom. And maybe we'll have a trunk that kind of goes down like that. Put in some dead branches again, if appropriate for that tree that we're painting. And then we'll have kind of this, maybe a big branch that kind of terminates over here on the right-hand side. So maybe a kind of a silhouette for maybe a Douglas fir tree. And that one's still pretty symmetrical, right? Again, this is a perfect illustration of how oftentimes our brains will want to revert back to that symmetrical mean. So let's see, maybe the trees outside my window are all very bunched together, but let's see if we can do a tree that has a little bit more variation to it. Maybe I'll start with a more kind of yellowy green color up top this time, and then fade the color and change the color as we go down again. So for this one, let's say I'm going to have another kind of big tree, but I'm going to have a double trunk to this tree. I'm going to try to make it kind of a big kind of Douglas fir of some kind. So I'll have kind of these big kind of angled branches. So up here, we'll kind of start with, again, tapping, dashing, kind of little dot marks at the top of that tree. As I work my way down, grabbing more of my blue color, and I'll just kind of start thinking about, and especially if I have a tree to look at, that's always helpful. But in particular, when I'm doing a bigger tree, I'm looking for kind of like, what's the angularity of the branches? Are they kind of all angled down or are they kind of going down and then up? Because each different tree species will have kind of a distinct silhouette that helps tell the story of what that tree is and how it likes to grow. So the angle of the branches is a big thing I'm often looking for inside of my trees. So like here's a Douglas fir tree roughly, and they often kind of have this characteristic kind of, branches that might kind of curve out a little bit, but then they also kind of weep down from that upper edge. And there we go, like that little guy might be done. So hopefully that one's a better illustration of how, by embracing more asymmetrical shapes, so adding asymmetry to our tree, we can really get a bunch of beautiful patterning happening in there. Any questions about those little tree friends there and kind of the technique I showed you for how to make the bigger tree? And again, this is my favorite way to do color variations in trees. I really prefer and love when I can just do the whole thing in one layer. That feels the most efficient and fast to me and saves me a lot of time. But then there are, of course, times where I do want a more precise application of color, in which case I'll just do one layer and then let it dry and add another layer. So there's nothing wrong with doing more layers. It's just kind of personal preference and what the subject is asking of us in our painting. So hopefully that answered your question, Allie. Okay. And while you guys are playing with that, I also wanted to kind of show a little illustration of just, and this will need a moment to dry so we can answer more questions while it's drying, but how we can kind of layer different, use our different paints and layers to create some depth and interesting effects. For this one, I'm just going to throw in some teal just for fun because I've been playing with this color since I was in Alaska. It's a semi-opaque color. It's a cobalt teal blue, really fun color. And if I know I'm going to be layering trees, I'll just try to make sure that my background layer, maybe I have this one and this one and this one over here. They're not too dark. So I'll intentionally kind of grab some more water on that paintbrush as I then just kind of dance the paintbrush across the trees. I often find that for me personally, when I was first learning how to paint these, if I went a little bit faster, my trees turned out better. Because by going faster, I had to kind of let go of some of my natural inclinations for precision. So if you are kind of like me in that same boat, then it is often, and I've had some students tell me it's helpful if they just kind of go a little bit faster, and also just playing with the tension of our hand. Sometimes I can get more organic looking brush strokes if I actually, again, kind of shake my hand a little bit intentionally. So that can kind of encourage some natural variability to be happening there. And I'm always so tempted to go too dark with my background layer of trees because I just find them to be so fun. So I'm just trying to kind of build in some trees here that I'll then come back into and add some darker ones in front of in a little bit. So there's that. Let me try to get rid of our reflection here. Let me see if I can get that up there. That was better over there. There we go. So while that's drying, getting ready for our next layer, what questions do folks have so far? Please go ahead and pop them in the chat. I just took a mostly dry brush here and was just kind of pulling that color down just to encourage those big puddles I had in the bottom parts of the trees to dry a little bit. And the cool thing, at least I'm going to put this aside while it dries for a moment. I can share a couple other examples. So one of the cool things to me is that kind of once I get that kind of core concept down of how to handle trees at different distances, then it was easier for me to start translating them into new landscapes. So this is a coastal scene from Oregon. There's a bunch of sea stacks. And as you can see, it's like the same idea. These trees in the background are all just kind of the single color. And then I just was looking at the unique shapes of these trees, and these were kind of more short and squat and had all these really long, like outreaching branches that kind of then came off of those shapes. And I really liked this scene because the really strong kind of backlight, the sun was kind of low over here, actually silhouetted a lot of the trees, so it made them a little bit easier to paint. Cindy asked if I tend to work mostly wet on dry for trees, or do I ever incorporate wet on wet sometimes? So it totally depends on what effect I'm going for. I find that wet on wet is really hard to control for trees, and I can show you a little example of that. So if you're newer to watercolor, what she's asking about is that, if I'm painting sometimes, and Cindy, correct me if I'm not exploring what you were thinking about. Let's say I have kind of like, this is my wet area on a page. And depending on how wet exactly our page is, you'll either get a lot of movement of our pigment or just a little bit. So I'm going to make two kind of little rectangles here, and we can play with that together just to kind of illustrate this idea. So on the right-hand side, I'm going to let that one dry out a little bit more, let that area dry a wee bit. And then over here, I'll show why. For me, usually if I'm adding tree shapes, I'm most often going for a shape that looks and kind of represents a tree. So as you can see here, like if I try to add kind of tree looking brush strokes to this, like they're going to work okay. but I am going to kind of lose a lot of my control over them. So I do this. I just haven't done it in an Adventure Art Academy lesson yet, but I definitely do use this. It's just a lot harder to control, as you can see, because the paint is just going to be carried by the total whims of the pigment inside of that space. So this can be a really wonderful effect, especially for like behind other shapes. So if I'm really wanting to be painting kind of the impression of a foggy or atmospheric day, I'll sometimes do this. And I can show over here that the longer we let our kind of wet base dry out a little bit, so it's drying-ish, but not fully dry, you can see that over here, I'm getting some movement of the paint, but it's a lot less than it was, especially in that upper area. So if we work kind of wet on wet, then down here it was drying out fully. So you can kind of see how whenever my brush strokes touch that wet area, I get these kind of blooming, more amorphous shapes. And then down here, where they're no longer in the wet and wet area, they're going to be a lot more hard edged. So this is why, depending on the effect I want, I'll use this sometimes, but usually again, only if I'm really going for that far distant effect. And sometimes I'll just kind of, like maybe I'll add some blooms to that. So I'll drop in some clean water and encourage some blooms to happen. So there's many different ways to approach that. It's something, it's used, but just not as often for trees. Oftentimes in my head, I'm kind of thinking of this as just like the overall ridgeline shape. It's going to have some amorphous tree blobs on it, and that's great. But you can see how over here, like just how much harder to control this is as soon as it starts to get wet. So I use it, but not as much as, just playing with the tree shapes themselves. Or I'll make shapes like this, like you can see how over here, see how this tree is still wet. And I can come in here and I can kind of come in with some cleanish water, and I can actually kind of fade out this shape once it's already made. So that can be a fun thing to do too. Like this paper is lifting off a ton. You can see how I kind of was able to erase and change that shape, and I can put back in kind of another ghostly looking tree into that area that I already changed up a little bit. So this paper, the pigment does not settle into it very much. You can see how just a tiny tap of the paper towel lifted off all of that paint. I would not get that much lifting if I were working on a paper that, a more cotton, some of the cotton papers. The one that I use from Arches is less prone to lifting like that. Some papers like from Hahnemühle, on the other hand, are super prone to lifting. So it just kind of depends on what paper we're using. So the last thing I want to show is just, how to kind of overlap some trees. So these are mostly dry enough. It's still a little cool to the touch, so I might get some kind of spreading of pigments, but I'm not going to worry about it. Not a big deal. We're practicing, we're playing, we're experimenting, and hopefully letting go of some expectations of perfection and just enjoying whatever our pigments want to do on our page today. So I'm going to come with a nice dark kind of purpley color, and then we'll just kind of use the same idea I was just using before. And my paintbrush had, again, too much water in it, so I wasn't able to get kind of fine little tapered brush strokes. So I'll just take off some of the moisture, and that makes it a little bit easier to manage. So there's my color, and I'll just kind of come back here and dance this tree right into my shape and put another one next to it. And sometimes, I like looking at this, like maybe my background trees could have even been a little bit lighter, so there's even more differentiation. Going from one area to another, maybe I'll just kind of switch back to my far away tree technique just to kind of give the impression of that kind of foreground stuff. Like, why not? This is like one of my favorite things when this happens, where I have the lighter behind and the darker in front. I just find that such a beautiful phenomena, and so also emblematic of so many days out here in the backcountry where we do have clouds. Some of my favorite photographs and paintings have been of scenes where it is just kind of that gorgeous atmospheric effect, and the layers of trees just kind of recede into a scene. And that's basically how I do it. Maybe it's a little bit more precision if I'm working on an overall big painting, but that's the overall approach for it. Okay. So that brings me to the conclusion of my structured content time. I'm going to allow you all to come back onto your microphones if you would like. So give me just a moment you can now unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question over voice. Otherwise, you can just drop it back in the chat. Then we have the next 10, 15 minutes for kind of an open Q&A. And I have a few more example paintings I can show you too of this different stuff, but I'll leave this one up for a few more minutes in case folks were still playing with their own pages.
Claire, could you tell us again the colors of that last that you used for the last set of trees you did?
The dark ones?
You were just the ones you were just doing of the different layers.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the beginning what the colors They're the ones that you were using in like Alaska. They're beautiful.
Yeah, so there's really kind of this is this background layer. The
Right.
kind of teal color is a cobalt teal blue. It's a shade by Daniel Smith. It's this one in my palette. It's not the most forgiving color because it does granulate. Again, you can kind of see some of that kind of sandy texture if I zoom in. See how I kind of separated out a little bit funny?
Yeah.
Well, that's because it has heavier, bigger particles. And mixed in
Okay.
with that was kind of a pink color. So I had some rose mixed in there and a little bit of my Indian throne blue, just like that was kind of on the palette. And then coming forward, I had the same thing. So some teal, but then I was also just throwing in a bunch more rose. I was also just darkening it by using some of that perylene green. So that's Peryllene. So perylene green, and I think I added a little bit of phthalo green too, and probably some Indian throne blue. I was just kind of grabbing colors. But it's funny because it's like that teal and that perylene green are definitely two of the colors that fall in kind of a lesser used collection of colors in my palette. Like I have 16, I kind of use the most. But then, like I said, when I was in Alaska, I really just kind of started trying to integrate them more because I really wanted those unique effects that kind of only some specific pigments can bring. And it looks like I found a question.
Yeah, I mean,
April,
it's really, I mean, like when you put it down, I love the look of that. It's beautiful.
Oh, I'm so glad. That's awesome. And I saw a question from April. She asked, how do I think, this is on YouTube, so I just saw it now. Sorry, April. How do I think about shorelines of trees? So from a distance, they're just quite a solid mass, but I select some to do individually to show their textures and shapes. I wonder if I have an example of this for you, April. So yes, and like, so if you can imagine, like this is like maybe if I have a big mass of trees on a shoreline, I may do it in a couple different layers and have one kind of the big overall silhouette of the trees, and I might come back in and call a few specific ones out. Or I might just kind of do the whole thing en masse. And usually this is my response, is just the whole area and then let some blooms and let some white spots show through and just let the magic of the pigment kind of do that hard work for me. I'm trying to find an example. I think it's actually packaged up in my Oregon painting box because we addressed this in the class. The closest thing I have to it is probably this painting here. So I can share this with you. So you can kind of see like, here's a mass of trees in front of Mount Rainier. And this is a 11 by 14 painting, which is also one of the classes. So and you can kind of see in this area, like how I handled just a really big mass of trees. And if it was smaller and farther away, I would have less detail. But I just was like, I don't have the mental and emotional bandwidth to paint all of this because my light was going away. There was just not time. So instead, I just picked out the like 10% of the trees that I thought looked interesting and painted those and relied on the natural tendencies of my pigments. So you can see here, I use some ultramarine blue. So that's a granulating sandy textured pigment. You can see how that added a lot of natural texture in there. Here's that rose color again. Here's a yellow. And this one was super funny because you can kind of see this like band of clouds I painted back here, right? So as I was painting these trees, sun was gone down, the mountains socked in again, and the cloud layer just drops right back down onto me in this painting. It got frigidly cold. I think it ended up being like 40 degrees and it had been decently comfortable-ish earlier. And then my paint just started to go everywhere. You can see here, the yellow is seeping out of the greens. Up here, the ultramarine, like this was like a dry base of the painting, right? I was shocked and laughing, and this painting refused to dry. So even though once I got the whole thing done and was like so proud because I was so nervous to finally film a reflection class because they're so hard, and it was, I'm intimidated by them still. So I was so happy it worked out. And then I had to carry the painting 2 miles back to camp, and it's like dark and I have my headlamp and my group was just laughing at me. So I'm trying not to fall and drop my painting. So, and that was all part of I share some of the footage of that at the end of the class because it was just so fun. So if you decide to paint with me more in the Adventure Art Academy, you definitely get the full spectrum of experience of, the beautiful scene, but also like you can hear the mosquitoes sometimes because they're so bad. All right, I saw a couple of questions. I missed one in here. Okay. All right, Tracy asked, what's my strategy for when the background layer of trees is darker and the foreground layer of trees is lighter? Opposite of what we just did. Tracy, I might need to go grab a different painting to show you because there is a solution to this and it's not that painting. I'm gonna go grab it. Give me just a moment. I don't think I have an example here. Nope. basically you paint dark and leave the other stuff behind, but it's very hard to describe. So I'll leave you with this one to look at, which is like more of your trees. Also, if you're painting tree shadows, you just make an angled tree shape. You don't have to reinvent the wheel or anything. You just change that tree shape. So let me go grab that painting. Okay. And okay, hang on just a second. I will be right back in just a second. Okay, I'm back. So back to, I think it was Tracy's question. Oh my gosh, I'm all tangled up in my cable here. So she was asking about how do you handle trees that are lighter than their background? So this is, oh, it's too big for my zoom level here. This was the only paintings I have not filed right now are all my lesson paintings. So that's what we're getting today. So I also, in addition to Northwest scenes, I have classes that feature desert scenes. And this was in a canyon in Capitol Reef National Park. So the way that I handle this is that I just kind of, paint around basically the brighter foliage. So whether it's lighter trees, they can be evergreen, they can be beautiful yellow cottonwoods, just paint around it. And oftentimes I'll start with a base layer of yellow, then do all the dark stuff and kind of cut back into it, and then finish up the rest of the yellow. This one was so fun. This painting almost ran away down the canyon. It's the wind blew it and I just barely caught it, and it's like it landed on the camera and I'm just laughing so hard because most of the time there's some hilarity in those. And here's another example of that same concept, but in a different application. This one is a class I haven't released yet. I'm saving it, I think, for this October, because that's the time of year when these trees appear like this. And this one's super fun. We actually integrate some white gouache into this painting. And this one also gave me fits. So I share in that class like how I handled rescuing rocks that went wildly sideways and we're not cooperating whatsoever. And how do I handle that? How do you move through the frustration to kind of try to rescue a painting that we love so much? So hopefully that answered that question about painting trees like that. Let's see here. I'm going to keep rolling way down. Alrighty. Cedar trees rather than firs. Okay, let me see. For sunlight hitting, so Cindy asked about sunlight hitting trees, maybe more of the closer foreground trees and foliage. What part of that is like just leaving little white spaces. Here's an example. And also, like, I love integrating white gouache into some paintings. This was a lesson from, when was this one filmed? This was last October's class, I believe. So this one was the first lesson where I really went into the integration of just white gouache itself with watercolor, and that allowed me to paint these lighter highlights back into the tree. And you can just kind of see those here. So again, with that opaque white pigment, it allows me to put the highlights back into that foliage. So hopefully that answered that one. I don't have time to show that in this little mini lesson, but again, this is, that's a full, I have the full recording of that class. If folks are interested, I'll be sending out more information about the Adventure Art Academy classes. It costs $25 a month, so I try to keep it really affordable. And yeah, I love working on them and taking you on little mini painting adventures all over the country with me. Somebody did ask, and I can show this one though, how do I handle more like, for like pine trees? So here's another scene from Crater Lake, and here see kind of like the more like variegated foliage. This is super easy once you figure it out. And the way I handle that, I just stuck my finger in my paint, is I will just grab some of my paint in whatever color I want that to be. It doesn't matter what that is for now. Fill up the paint with paintbrush, fill up the paintbrush with paint. Then I pinch the paintbrush, and you can see how as I pinch it and kind of roll my fingers, see how it slays the bristles out like that? And now, instead of making a nice mark like this, I can make marks that look like this. And that can work for grass. So it's amazing for dune grass. This also works really well if we kind of use it in an angled and irregular fashion like this. It works super well as kind of giving the impression of foliage on like a pine tree branch. That's kind of my go-to for pine trees, because you can see how you can just kind of dance that around, and it gives you just this really lovely organic patterning and shapes just by changing the angle of that paintbrush. So if you're someone who's like, my trees are just looking kind of funny, you can integrate this into even normal evergreen trees, and it's a really fun tool to use. Okay, scrolling down. Oh, Michelle asked, how do I add ink to my watercolor trees? Usually ink just happens as a base layer, like a part of my sketch. None of these paintings have ink in them, I don't think. But I'm so glad you asked, because I forgot to mention this, and that using ink is actually one of my really favorite tools in a painting. Do I have an example? So this is a painting that the whole painting didn't end up making it because I didn't like how it turned out, but I can show you a little section at the top where you can see that there is ink in there. It's just hard to see. So hopefully you can just kind of pick out, there's just a little bit of fine ink lines kind of along this ridge and into these trees in here. So usually I honestly, like, I prefer not to have ink in the trees if I could, but then it doesn't look balanced with the rest of the ink lines. So my solution is to have just like the bare minimum ink lines and then just not worry if my tree lines put on top of them kind of transgress outside of those little boundaries, if that makes sense. But then in addition, like, so that's like how I handle it with watercolor. One of the ways that I've really learned and practiced how to paint trees is to use this amazing tool called, it's called a ink brush, or is that what it's called? My brain is missing the name. It's basically a pen, and instead of a nib or a felt tip, it has a paintbrush tip on it, and you fill it with ink. So it's a brush pen. That's what it's called. So it has a little brush here, and you can get these amazing little teeny tiny brush strokes, or you can get curved lines. And if you vary the amount of pressure, you get different shaped lines. So I love this one. And I feel like I should do a mini workshop just on this stuff alone. I love, and I've learned so much about painting trees by ink sketching trees with this tool specifically, because it helps so much. This is a sketchbook from last year when I did 100 days of sketches in ink, and I did all of these without any pencil sketches. And it was incredibly transformative in my ability to render a scene. So how to draw a scene basically efficiently. But this is a whole tree shape just done with the ink pen and the brush pen, and I love it so much. So this brush pen is called, this is the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen. And I'll again include a link to this so you don't have to worry about finding it. They're a little hard to find sometimes. And I've had this one for a very long time. It's held up very well, about 10 years. I flew with this and my fountain pens, and none of them exploded on the airplane. So that was great. But again, like, this is honestly, it's like sometimes painting with watercolor can feel somewhat inaccessible because we have to like get all of our equipment out and deal with the mess of stuff. So that's why I really, really love using the brush pen to practice, because I went through a tree phase, right? These were all from the Oregon coast. So I was just doing studies of the silhouettes of them. And this day was like midnight and I was really, really done. Some days I did more sketches, and some days it was like, I can't figure out rocks. Sometimes I had more complex sketches that I really liked, and other days they were more simple. There's more trees. These are all just the same pen, because when you're working on a smooth paper like this, you can really use like the whole surface area of that brush pen, and you can really put a lot of pigment down really, really rapidly. There's the tiny trees. They also carry over to a brush pen beautifully. Here's a weird madrona tree. Here's the tiny trees again on rocks. So maybe my next mini lesson should be like the basics of ink sketching, because again, this was this was some attempts at some swampy trees. Not all of my sketches are perfect and beautiful. That one was a mess. And then this is another night where I was like, I'm tired. I'm also tired that day. And then, I had a little bit more time that day. And this is also that someone asked about, how do you make lighter trees? Practicing in ink is a great way to force our brain to start thinking about making the stuff behind darker. Okay, I'm getting lots of enthusiasm for an ink sketching basics class. So that might be where we head next. Well, I mean, it's 7:02, so I'm going to wrap things up. I can stay on for one or two more questions if folks want, but I just wanted to say thank you all so much for joining me for this little mini workshop. And I hope that if you enjoyed this and you would like to learn how to paint scenes like this one or this one from the desert, that you might check out the Adventure Art Academy classes. I love making them. That's why I always tell folks about them. We have a really wonderful community of folks from all over the world, because those classes are obviously pre-recorded, so you can do them at your own time. And honestly, what I love maybe the most about them is that, or I've heard students love, is you can hit pause and you can rewind me. So if I get too excited and start talking too fast, you can rewind me and you're good to go. I do not yet have subtitles on those full lessons. You can do subtitles here on Zoom and YouTube for this recording, but I'm hoping my site will enable subtitles soon. That's a big accessibility thing I'm trying to work toward when I can. But in the meantime, it's just so much fun, and I hope to see you in some of the other painting adventures, because you get access to all of these, not just the current ones. You get a new one every month. And then you get, you can go back to the 25 and counting. So there's a lot of fun there. And I have like color swatch days sometimes where we play with like how to mix colors. So I have a ton of fun with them, and every lesson shows you techniques kind of like we did today and how they apply to that specific landscape. Any last questions from folks? I'm happy to stay on for a couple more minutes. Michelle asked if it's possible to have a too pointy round brush. It is entirely possible, because if your brush is so pointy that it can't, that it won't fill up kind of below the 0.2, then definitely it'll just make, I call them jailhouse trees, where we have like all the same shape. I kind of forgot to mention that. It's one of my favorite phrases. So if they're all the same shape, all lined up perfectly, then they're jailhouse trees. So it's sometimes a too pointy brush can happen. Because some round brushes are so extraordinarily narrow and pointy. Oh my gosh, look at all these beautiful sketch pages. Thank you for showing me. I love that. Jessica, hello. Look
Can
at
you
those gorgeous
fix it if
pages.
it's too pointy, or is it just like get a different brush?
Do you want to hold up your brush, Michelle, and I can see? Let me turn back to speaker view. If you speak and say hello, I can see it.
Hello.
There we go. Okay. That one, okay.
It doesn't really make teardrop shaped lines anymore. I don't know. And I have another one that's even pointier now. But I like these because they're Rosemary and Company brushes, and so they're good for travel because the lid covers the brush.
I love that. Those are very beautiful. I have like one of those brushes, and I like jealously guard it because I'm so hard on my paint brushes. Honestly, like, you know, like those brushes, because they're so nicely shaped. So they have like a really beautiful kind of bold base, and then they have the tapered tip. And like that's how the bristles are cut, and like which hairs they use to make that happen. So for your paintbrush, like yours would probably work for a big painting where you had like, you know, yay big trees instead of like yay big trees. So I mean, honestly, I would say just like I'll include a link to this in the follow-up email. They're like $5 to $7. Just get one to try it and then see how it goes. Because this brush, you can see it's like the whole thing kind of just taper, like it's pretty evenly width. The width is very even to about here. So like 2/3 of the brush is the same width. And then just the very tip changes. So, and as I squish it, that tip kind of flattens out. So that's one reason why I like these, because they're really forgiving, because they can make such a big swath, and they're so cheap. If I mess it up after 2 months, I don't mind replacing it. And then it goes into my bin of paintbrushes if I ever, which I may not, but if I ever did workshops for kids again, I now have like 10 of these.
Right.
Well, I'm going to wrap things up for us. I will work on this recording this evening and or tomorrow morning. Let's be real. I'm currently in the middle of editing my next Adventure Art Academy class for release on Friday, because I just literally got back a couple of days ago from the Yukon, and it's a class I filmed on an ice field in the middle of the St. Elias Mountains, which was so fun. And my painting froze in the middle of it, and it was amazing. So I'll work on this and that tomorrow, but this will definitely be out to everybody by noon at the latest tomorrow.